The rain had been falling since dawn, soft, steady, and patient, like a melody that refused to end. Claire sat by the window, a cup of warm tea cradled between her hands. The world outside her small suburban home looked blurred, wrapped in silver mist. It was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass. She had always loved the rain. It reminded her of moments that once mattered, of laughter shared under broken umbrellas, of walks through city streets when love had seemed simple and forever. But lately, the rain only made her feel the weight of years gone by. At 43, Claire lived alone. Her husband had passed away nearly a decade ago. And though time had softened the edges of grief, it hadn't filled the empty corners of her heart. She had friends, of course, and neighbors who waved when they saw her in the garden, but at night. The silence in her home often felt too deep, like an ocean she couldn't quite swim across. Still, Claire was not bitter. She was kind, composed, and quietly strong, the sort of woman people trusted without knowing why. She volunteered at the local library, taught children how to read, and baked cookies for her elderly neighbor every Sunday. Yet, even with all her warmth, something in her life felt unfinished, like a song missing its final verse. It was on one such rainy morning that everything began to change. A gentle knock echoed from the front door. Claire set down her cup and went to open it, surprised to see her sister Anna, standing there with a boy beside her, tall, thin, and shy. "Claire," Anna began, brushing raindrops from her coat, "I'm so sorry to drop in like this, but I need to ask you for a favor." "Ka?" Her tone was urgent yet hopeful, the kind that left no room for refusal. "Of course," Claire said softly. "Come in." They settled in the living room, the fire crackling gently. Anna placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "You remember Ethan, don't you?" Claire smiled. "Of course I do. Last time I saw you, you were what, 10? Ethan blushed. "I'm 18 now, Aunt Claire." The word aunt sounded strange and tender in her ears. It had been years since she'd heard it spoken so warmly. Anna sighed. "Claire, I have to travel overseas for work for a few months. It's a big project, and I can't take Ethan with me right now. Would you mind if he stayed here until I return?" For a moment, Claire hesitated, not because she didn't want to help, but because she'd grown used to solitude. Her home had become her quiet world, and she wasn't sure how it would feel to share it again. But when she looked into Ethan's polite, uncertain eyes, something inside her softened. "Of course he can stay," she said. "I'd love the company." Anna's face brightened. "Thank you, Claire. You have no idea how much this means." After Anna left that afternoon, the house felt different. Not empty, but quietly expectant. Ethan unpacked his things in the guest room, while Claire made him hot chocolate, the way she used to when he was small. They ate dinner together, simple pasta and salad, and, though they spoke little, the silence wasn't heavy. It felt comfortable, like a pause before something meaningful. Later that night, Claire stood by the window again, watching the rain taper off into mist. She could hear Ethan softly strumming his guitar upstairs, at gentle, uncertain melody that made her smile. Maybe, she thought, this house needed a little music again. Over the next few days, a rhythm began to form. Claire would wake early, make breakfast, and find Ethan already at the table, sketching in his notebook or reading quietly. He was thoughtful for his age, introspective, kind, and polite. He helped with groceries, mowed the lawn without being asked, and even fixed the broken porch light. They talked sometimes about music, books, and life. He told her about his dream of studying art, about how the world sometimes felt too loud, and how he often found peace in drawing. Claire listened, seeing pieces of herself in him, the same quiet heart, the same love for small, unnoticed things. One evening, while they were washing dishes together, Ethan said something that made her pause. "Aunt Claire," he began hesitantly, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" She smiled gently. "Of course. What is it?" He looked down at the soap bubbles swirling in the sink. "Do you think love ever really goes away? Like when someone you cared about isn't there anymore?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't answer. Her mind drifted back to another time, another face, Daniel, the man she'd once planned a future with before life as it often does, changed direction. Finally, she said quietly, "No, Ethan, I don't think love ever disappears. I think it changes. It finds a new shape, a new home, sometimes even a new meaning." Ethan nodded, deep in thought. "I was hoping you'd say that." She smiled faintly, hiding the ache his question had stirred. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I just wanted to understand it better." Claire didn't press further. She could tell there was more behind his questions, something unsaid, something tender. But she also knew some answers reveal themselves only when the heart is ready. That night, as she turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, Claire realized something had shifted. Her quiet, predictable world was no longer so quiet. There was curiosity again, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, a gentle stirring of life. Maybe. She thought Ethan's arrival wasn't just about giving him a place to stay. Maybe it was about reminding her heart how to feel again. She didn't know it yet. But his simple question, the one about love would open doors she had long kept closed. And before the month was over, both their lives would change in ways neither could have imagined. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, scattering soft gold across the counter. Claire was already awake, her hands busy kneading dough for bread. The quiet rhythm of morning comforted her, the sound of the whisk, the smell of coffee, the hum of a world just beginning to stir. Ethan entered, his hair still messy from sleep, holding his sketchbook close to his chest. "Morning, Aunt Claire," he said, voice warm with that mix of youth and gentleness she had come to adore. "Good morning," she replied, smiling. "Coffee's ready, and I'm making fresh bread. You picked a good day to wake early." He laughed softly and sat at the table, opening his sketchbook. Claire noticed the faint pencil lines of a familiar shape, her house, drawn from the view of the garden. "That's lovely," she said, leaning over his shoulder. "You even got the roses, right?" He shrugged modestly. "They're my favorite part of the house. They feel alive somehow." She nodded, her eyes drifting to the window where the rosebush stood heavy with blooms. "They were Daniel's favorite too," she said, before realizing she'd spoken his name aloud. Ethan looked up. "Daniel?" Her voice softened. "Someone I used to know a long time ago." He waited, silent but curious. Claire took a slow breath. For years she had carried the memory quietly, like a folded letter in her heart. But somehow, speaking it aloud to Ethan didn't feel painful. It felt freeing. "Daniel and I met when I was 22, she began. "I was new in the city, working at a small bookstore near the park. He used to come in every Thursday, always buying the same kind of novel, old travel stories mostly. One day, I asked him why. He said reading about people finding their way made him believe he could find his too." She smiled faintly, remembering. He had this calm energy about him, like he was always half in a dream. We'd talk about everything, books, music, life, all of it. Before I knew it, Thursday became my favorite day. Ethan listened quietly, his eyes soft with interest. "So what happened?" Claire's smile dimmed slightly. "Life. He got offered a teaching position across the country. He wanted me to come with him, but I was afraid to leave everything I knew. I thought love would wait until I was ready. But by the time he was gone." The room was still for a moment, filled only by the sound of the coffee machine finishing its cycle. Claire turned away, brushing an invisible crumb from the counter. "I guess some people leave and you never stop wondering what might have been." Ethan spoke gently. "Do you ever think about reaching out to him again?" She shook her head slowly. "Too much time has passed. He probably has a family now. A life that doesn't include me." He nodded, thoughtful. "Still, it's strange how love doesn't fade. It just stays quiet until something wakes it up." Her gaze met his, surprised at the depth of his words. "You're wiser than most people your age." He smiled shyly. "Maybe I just listen more than I talk." Later that day, they took a walk through the park near Claire's home. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the smell of pine and earth after rain. Families strolled by, children laughing, dogs running through the grass. Ethan carried his camera, taking quiet pictures of leaves and sunlight. Claire watched him, admiring his quiet curiosity. There was something about him, a kindness, that reminded her of Daniel at that age. As they sat on a bench, Ethan showed her a photo he had taken, the reflection of a tree in a puddle, shimmering like a dream. "It looks like two worlds," he said softly. Claire smiled. "Maybe it is, the one we live in and the one we remember." He looked at her carefully. "You really loved him, didn't you?" "I did," she admitted. "And maybe part of me still does. But sometimes love isn't about getting someone back. It's about being grateful they were ever yours at all." Ethan turned the camera off, his voice quiet. "That's beautiful, Aunt Claire." She looked at him, then really looked and realized how much he had grown. Not just taller, but wiser, more thoughtful, carrying his own quiet questions about life. That evening, as twilight. The next morning began with the sound of the mail slot clicking shut. Claire was making oatmeal when she heard the soft thud of envelopes hitting the floor. She didn't think much of it at first. Bills, grocery flyers, the usual rhythm of an ordinary day. But as she bent down to collect them, one envelope caught her eye. It was cream-colored, the edges slightly worn, the handwriting instantly familiar. Her breath caught. The name written across it, Claire Morgan, was penned in the same looping script she'd seen in her memories. It couldn't be. For a moment she stood frozen, the room silent except for the ticking clock. Then she turned the envelope over. No return address. Only a faint scent of old paper and rain. Ethan entered the kitchen just then, holding his camera. "Morning, Aunt Claire," he said cheerfully, then paused when he saw her expression. "Everything okay?" She swallowed. "I think so. I'm not sure." He looked at the letter in her hands. "What's that?" "I don't know yet," she whispered, "but it looks like something or someone from a long time ago." Claire sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of her like a secret waiting to be told. Ethan sat across from her, curious but respectful. "Do you want me to give you a minute?" he asked. She smiled softly. "No, stay. I think I might need a little courage." Careful hands. She opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of parchment paper, yellowed with age. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. "If you ever find this, it means I didn't forget. I never could." Some stories don't end. They just wait until someone is brave enough to open them again. It was signed Daniel. A single tear slipped down her cheek. For years she had wondered if he'd thought of her, if their love had been real or simply a memory she kept alive alone. Now this letter answered everything. She traced the ink with her fingertips, her heart trembling with quiet disbelief. Ethan reached across the table, his voice gentle. "He wrote that to you?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, a long time ago. Maybe even before he left." He looked at her thoughtfully. "So he never forgot you?" Her smile was tender but heavy. "It seems that way." The rest of the day passed in a haze of thought. Claire cleaned, cooked, and went through her usual chores. But her mind kept drifting back to Daniel, his laughter, his patience. The way he used to listen as if every word she said mattered. Later that evening, while tidying up the attic, she found an old wooden box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs, postcards, and a few handwritten notes tied with ribbon. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by memories. Ethan appeared at the doorway, noticing her deep in thought. "You're okay up here?" She smiled faintly. "Just visiting the past." He stepped inside, looking at one of the old photos, Claire and Daniel standing near the bookstore where they'd met, both laughing at something out of frame. "You look happy," Ethan said softly. "I was," she replied. "It was a different time. But sometimes the past isn't as far away as we think." Ethan nodded. "Maybe this letter found you for a reason." She looked at him, her heart tightening. "What do you mean?" "Maybe it's life's way of telling you that some things aren't finished. Maybe you were meant to read it now, not before." Claire thought about that long after he left the attic. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe life had a strange way of circling back when you least expected it. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the letter beside her, as rain began to fall again. The sound brought comfort, familiar rhythm that matched the pulse of her thoughts. She whispered into the quiet Daniel, "Did you still think of me all this time?" Her heart wanted to believe yes. The next morning, Ethan suggested they go to the town's weekend market. Claire agreed she needed the distraction. The marketplace buzzed with life. Children laughing, vendors calling out prices. Music floating through the air as they walked past a stall selling handmade pottery. Claire's gaze caught something on a nearby table, a framed photograph of the local music school. Standing in the picture, smiling with a group of students, was a face she would have recognized anywhere. Daniel, her heart stopped. She stared at the picture, her hands trembling. Beneath the photo was a small label, Harborfield Music Academy faculty and students. 2023, Ethan, she whispered, pointing at the picture. That's him. Ethan's eyes widened. The Daniel. She nodded, still staring. He's here. In this town? For a long moment, they both just stood there, the noise of the market fading into silence. Ethan broke it gently. You have to talk to him, Anne Claire. You've been given a second chance. She hesitated. After all these years? What would I even say? He smiled softly. Start with, hello. The following days passed in a blur of restless thoughts. After sending that short message to Daniel, Claire found herself checking her inbox every few hours. Sometimes she'd laugh at her own impatience. Other times, she'd just stare at the screen, wondering if she had done the right thing. By the third day, she had almost convinced herself to stop waiting. Maybe he'd forgotten. Maybe the past was meant to stay folded away like an old letter. But then, one quiet afternoon, her phone chimed. It was an email. From Daniel Hayes. Her heart skipped as she opened it. Claire, I can hardly believe it's you. I never thought you'd see that letter. I didn't even know if it ever reached you. I'm teaching music now just a few miles from your town. If you're open to it, I'd love to meet and talk, even if it's just to say hello after all these years. Her breath trembled. There it was, the bridge between past and present. She never expected to cross again. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her mind alive with memories. The smell of the bookstore where they'd met. The way his laughter used to fill a room, the day he said goodbye without saying the words, goodbye. Finally, she typed a simple reply. Hello, Daniel. I'd like that very much. They chose to meet at a quiet cafe by the lake that Sunday afternoon when Claire arrived. She paused outside the door, steadying her breath. The world felt softer somehow, the air touched by autumn, the sky pale and gold. She caught her reflection in the glass and smiled faintly. She didn't look 22 anymore. But there was a quiet strength in her eyes now, kind of grace that only time could give. Then she saw him. Daniel. He was sitting by the window. A book open beside a half-empty cup of coffee. His hair was touched with silver, his smile still gentle and familiar. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stood, and everything around her, the voices, the hum of the cafe faded into silence. Claire, he said softly, almost like a question. Daniel. They both laughed quietly at how strange and natural it felt to say each other's names again. He gestured toward the seat across from him. You look exactly the same. She smiled, shaking her head. You always were a terrible liar. He laughed, and the sound filled the space between them, warm, familiar, and comforting. For a while, they talked about simple things, work, friends, small memories that had survived the years. It felt easy, but beneath the words lingered something deeper. A quiet awareness of everything they weren't saying. After a pause, Daniel looked out the window and said, I didn't think you'd ever want to hear from me again. Claire tilted her head. Why would you think that? He sighed softly. Because when I left, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you wanted to stay, that you needed to build your life there. I told myself that leaving would make it easier for both of us. But it didn't. She looked down at her cup, tracing the rim with her finger. You never told me you wrote that letter. I didn't send it, he admitted. I left it with a friend who promised to give it to you if you ever came by the old shop. I didn't know if it ever reached you. It did, she said quietly. Just a few years late. He smiled faintly. Maybe right on time. For a moment, silence filled the air. Not awkward, but fragile and full of things they hadn't said. Claire watched him carefully. His eyes were older now, but still held that same kindness she had fallen for so long ago. Finally, she whispered, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we hadn't drifted apart?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. Every day. Her breath caught. There was no bitterness in his tone, only truth, gentle, steady, and deeply human. "I used to think," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that we lost each other because of fear, because I was afraid to leave. And you were afraid to stay." He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but I think we were also just young. We thought love would wait without effort. We didn't realize how easily silence can grow between two people." Claire's eyes glistened. "And yet here we are." Daniel smiled softly. "Here we are." They stayed at the cafe until the sky turned violet and the lake shimmered under the fading sun as they walked outside. The evening air was cool, scented faintly with pine and rain. They stood by the water's edge, a few feet apart, the reflections trembling in the ripples below. "I don't know what this means," Claire said quietly. "Seeing you again?" Daniel turned toward her. "It doesn't have to mean anything right now. Maybe it just means we found each other again. Maybe that's enough." She smiled, her heart heavy but calm. "You always did know what to say." He chuckled softly. "Only when I mean it." A light breeze lifted her hair. For a moment, time seemed to pause, not asking for promises, not rewriting history, just letting two people stand in the truth of what still lingered. When Claire returned home, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table sketching. He looked. The week after Claire and Daniel met again felt different. Not because anything drastic had happened, but because something subtle had shifted inside her, the quiet routine of her days preparing breakfast, helping Ethan with his art school forms, walking to the library now, carried a faint echo of something unfinished. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart fluttered before she even looked at the screen. Daniel had sent her a few messages since that first meeting. Short, thoughtful ones. "The sky looked like that afternoon at the lake today. Your advice about my students helped more than you think." Each one felt like a thread weaving the present into their shared past. Yet beneath the simple words, something deeper pulsed. Something neither had dared to name. One Friday evening, Daniel invited her to a small community concert his students were performing. "It's nothing grand," it said, almost apologetically. "Just some local kids and a few old songs. But I'd love it if you came." Claire agreed, though she wasn't sure why her heart beat so fast when she said yes. The hall was warm and softly lit, filled with the chatter of parents and laughter of children tuning their instruments. When Daniel stepped onto the small stage to introduce the students, Claire couldn't help but notice how naturally he belonged there. The same confidence that once drew her to him was still there, but tempered now by age and gentleness. As the music began, something stirred inside her. The melody, slow, familiar, tender, was one she hadn't heard in years. It was the same song Daniel used to play when they were younger. When the world felt simple and full of possibility, when the final note faded, the audience applauded, but Claire sat still, her hands trembling slightly. Later, as the crowd began to leave, Daniel found her near the door. "You stayed through the whole performance," he said with a soft smile. "I couldn't leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That song." He nodded. "I thought you'd recognize it." Her eyes glistened. "You remembered. I never forgot." They walked outside together. The night was cool with the faint scent of rain on the wind. The streetlights cast a golden glow on the empty road, and their footsteps echoed softly as they walked side by side. For a long moment, neither spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that comes when words feel too small for what's stirring beneath them. Finally, Claire stopped. "Daniel," she said, turning to face him, "why did you really want to see me again?" He froze, caught off guard by the question. Then he exhaled slowly. "Because I couldn't stop wondering what my life might have been if I hadn't walked away." Her heart tightened. "And now that you've seen me again?" He looked into her eyes and his expression softened. "Now I know I still care." The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. Claire's breath caught. "Daniel, I'm not saying I expect anything," he continued quickly. "I just needed to be honest. I've carried this for too long, the thought that maybe I let something real slip away. I thought I could bury it in work, in music, in time. But the truth is, seeing you again made me realize it never really left." Claire stood still, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had imagined hearing those words 100 times in her life. But now that they were real, she didn't know how to respond. "You don't owe me an answer," he said gently. "I just needed to say it out loud for once." She looked down, her eyes stinging. "You always knew how to speak your heart. I never did." He smiled faintly. "You did. You just used silence to do it." They began walking again. "Slower now? I used to think about what might have happened if I'd gone with you back then," Claire said quietly. "But I was scared. My parents needed me. Life here felt safe, predictable. I told myself I was doing the right thing." Daniel nodded. "And maybe you were. We both made choices that made sense at the time. But sometimes I wonder if doing the right thing means giving up the thing that makes you feel alive." Claire hesitated, then asked softly, "And what makes you feel alive now?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "This talking to you again. Remembering what it felt like to care about someone so deeply that it shaped who I became." The honesty in his voice made her throat tighten. She wanted to speak. To tell him that she too had thought of him through the years. That his memory lived quietly in the corners of her life, but fear held her back instead. She said softly, "You were always part of my story, Daniel. I just didn't know how much until now." They reached the bridge overlooking the lake, the same one they had visited days earlier. The moonlight shimmered on the water like silver dust. Daniel leaned on the railing, gazing at the reflection. "You know, I almost didn't come back here. I thought too much time had passed." "Time doesn't erase everything," she said. "Some things stay even when we pretend they don't." "Do you ever wish we could start again?" Claire's breath caught, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she whispered, "I don't know if starting again is possible. But maybe understanding what we had is." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Daniel reached out instinctively, but stopped himself halfway, his hand hovering before gently retreating. They didn't need touch to understand what was felt. It was there, in the space between them, a live and undeniable dot as they stood in silence. A distant church bell chimed 9 times. The sound echoed softly across the water. Claire finally spoke. "You were right to tell the truth, Daniel. I think I've needed to hear it for a long time." He smiled sadly. "And what about your truth?" She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Mine is that I never stopped caring either. I just stopped admitting it even to myself." For a heartbeat, the world seemed still. Then Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. "That's enough for me." As they walked back toward their cars, the air between them felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because the truth was finally free. Claire realized that honesty didn't always lead to answers or happy endings. Sometimes it simply opened the door to peace, and peace, she thought, was its own kind of love. The days after Claire and Daniel's conversation felt quieter, yet strangely peaceful. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden ending or beginning, just a stillness that carried a sense of understanding. For the first time in years, Claire felt lighter. The truth had been spoken, and though it stirred both joy and ache, it also set her free from the weight of what if. Ethan noticed the change before she said a word. "You've been smiling more?" he said one morning as they prepared breakfast together. Claire chuckled softly. "Have I?" "Yeah," Ethan said with a grin. "It's different. Like you're thinking about something good." She hesitated before answering. "Maybe I'm just remembering that life can still surprise us." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood more than his age suggested. "I think that's what love does. It surprises us when we stop expecting it." His words made her pause. So much of what had happened, the letter, the reunion, the conversation by the lake, had started because of him. He had opened a door she didn't realize was still closed, and now, somehow, she was walking through it again, that afternoon. As autumn sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Claire sat down with a cup of tea and looked out at the maple trees swaying gently in the breeze. The golden leaves reminded her of time's quiet passing, how years could vanish. Yet emotions remained, soft and unbroken beneath it all. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "I'm leaving for a short trip with my students this weekend. Just wanted to thank you for listening and for letting the past finally breathe." She smiled, her eyes warm. "I should thank you, too. You helped me remember what it means to feel." A moment later, another message came through. "When I get back, maybe we could take a walk by the lake again." No expectations. Just a walk. She stared at the words, her heart quiet but steady. Then she typed back simply, "I'd like that." That weekend, while Daniel was away, Claire found herself cleaning out the attic, a task she'd avoided for years. There were old boxes of photographs, yellowed letters, keepsakes from her teaching days, and one small, dusty music box she hadn't opened since she was a teenager. When she wound it, a familiar tune drifted out, soft, delicate. The same melody Daniel had played at the concert. It was almost as if the music had been waiting for her. Patiently tucked away all these years, she closed her eyes and listened, smiling through quiet tears. The melody wasn't just a reminder of Hemet, was a reminder of who she had been, and who she still was underneath all the years of routine and responsibility. When the song ended, she whispered, "I'm still here." It wasn't said to anyone in particular, but in her heart. She knew Daniel would have understood. A few days later, Daniel returned. They met again, just as they had planned, walking by the same lake where so many of their conversations had taken place. The trees were losing their last leaves now, their colors fading into early winter gray. But there was something peaceful about it. The quiet acceptance of change Daniel carried. A small notebook in his hand. "I brought this for you," he said, smiling shyly. "It's a collection of poems my students wrote about memories. I thought you might like it." Claire took it gently. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." They walked in silence for a while, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet filling the air. Finally, Claire spoke. "You know, when I was younger, I thought love had to be perfect to be real, that it had to last forever or it didn't count." Daniel looked at